Hello, and welcome to our second in this series of videos that are going to help you pass your high-stakes math test. And we're starting out in the beginning of this series with just some fundamental basic concepts that, if understood, other things are going to be easier. So the second thing that we're going to look at is multiplication of fractions. Now, some things that were true in elementary school when you only knew about whole numbers are no longer true when you know about other kinds of numbers. And one of those things is that multiplication results in a bigger answer. That kind of gets ingrained into us in the earlier grades because we're taught that multiplication, the mental model for that is like 2 times 3 would mean you have 2 blocks in a group and you've got 3 groups. And that model can only result in a bigger answer. But once you have different kinds of numbers, that's no longer true. And sometimes we just internalize that and we don't understand why we have anxiety when we're doing math. But it's often because of the underlying assumptions that we don't realize have expired. This might help illustrate how some of the mental frameworks that you learned in elementary school that you just take for granted can trip you up later, especially in word problems when you're deciding what operation to use. So take a simple problem like this. John has 6 pounds of coffee. He uses half a pound per day. How many days will his coffee last? Well, you know instinctively the coffee is going to last more than 6 days. So the answer is going to be bigger than 6. And a lot of people will just assume, I need to multiply because the answer is going to be bigger than 6. And so they'll multiply 6 times a half. And by the time they're doing the math, they forget what the question even was, so they don't realize that the answer doesn't make sense. Or the answer comes out to be less than 6, and then they have what we call math anxiety. If you feel like you experience math anxiety, one of the reasons could be this, that you've got this mental framework that got so instilled in you in elementary school that it feels like things don't make sense, even when you think you're doing the right thing. Like you know that answer to this is going to be bigger than 6, but you think multiplication results in bigger answers, and then you multiply and the answer is smaller and you don't know what happened. But one of the things that you can do is, first of all, you've got to realize that those mental frameworks have expired. But to help yourself get through problems like this, substitute easy elementary school numbers and ask yourself, what would the operation be if these were the numbers? Because the operation is what it is. It doesn't matter what the numbers are. If John had 6 pounds of coffee and he uses 2 pounds a day, how many days will his coffee last? Well, 2 pounds a day, and he uses 6 pounds of coffee, it's going to be division. 6 divided by 2 is 3. And see, all of that makes sense. 3 is fewer days than 6, which you know it should be because he's using 2 pounds a day. But that tells you the operation is division. And now, if you go back to the original problem, you know the operation is division. It's going to be 6 divided by a half. Well, how do you divide 6 by a half? Well, that's what comes next. In multiplication, opposite means the number flipped upside down. They also call this the reciprocal. And if you don't have a fraction, so you really can't flip it upside down, you can always put a 1 under it, and then you can flip it upside down. So the opposite of 1/5 is 5 over 1. The opposite of a third is 3 over 1. The opposite of a negative number is a negative number because all you're doing is flipping it upside down. You're not changing the sign. So the reciprocal of negative 2/3 is negative 3/2. Okay, here's a rule that's an important rule. Don't ever divide. Change division to multiply the opposite. So 3 divided by a half is 3 times 2 over 1. The opposite of a half is 2 over 1. You flip it. Change divide to times and multiply the opposite. 4/5 divided by 8/3 is 4/5 times 3/8. So you don't need to know how to divide fractions because you're never going to do it. You change division to multiplication and multiply by the opposite. So you just need to know how to multiply fractions, and that is easy. You multiply straight across. 4/5 times 3/2. 4 times 3 gives us 12. 5 times 2 gives us 10. Now, of course, we could reduce that at many different points, but the point here is just to know how to multiply fractions straight across. So what we covered here is you need to realize that multiplication gives you a bigger answer is an idea that has expired. Now that you know about numbers other than the counting numbers, that's no longer true. With fractions, you can multiply and get a smaller number as an answer. In multiplication, when we say the opposite, we mean the number flipped upside down. Two fractions are opposites if one is the other one flipped upside down. And if you've got a whole number, put a 1 under it if you need to get the opposite of it. Don't ever divide. Always change to times the opposite. And multiplying fractions, you multiply straight across.